Okay, and then finally, let's talk about energy. Okay, the rigging up of fuel prices, which these people have conspired in, both, for instance, by stopping drilling. You know, the U.S. created the oil industry in 1859, led it for over a century. In World War II, we produced half again as much oil as the whole rest of the world put together. But U.S. oil production peaks in what year? 1971, the same year as the Environmental Protection Agency goes into action. And it's been declining ever since. If it had been allowed to continue at the same rate it had in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the U.S. today, instead of producing 5.5 million barrels of oil a year, would be producing 5.5 million barrels of oil a day, would be producing 35, okay, which would be enough to displace the entirety of OPEC's production from the world market, which is 30 million barrels. But the rigging up of oil prices is an enormous crime against the world economy and against humanity, because it's not just a matter that it's unpleasant to pay $4 a gallon for gas. You rig up oil prices, you cause unemployment in the U.S., and here's a graph, and it's in the book. It shows how every time the oil price goes up, unemployment shoots up. But you create recession conditions in the advanced sector, you create starvation conditions in the third world. Okay? And the casualties from this are enormous. And then finally, we have the global warming campaign, which is astonishing because global warming is actually good. I mean, the climate's always changing. Warming periods are better. They lengthen the growing season, they increase net rainfall worldwide, and CO2 enrichment to the atmosphere accelerates plant growth, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. You can do the experiment in the lab any time. Okay? But yet, they're saying, well, you haven't run out of oil, but you've run out of the right to use fuel, so we must suppress human activity. I mean, if we were causing CO2 levels in the atmosphere to decrease, they might have a point. But that we're making the world a more fertile planet. They say we should put shackles on humanity. This shows that their fundamental interest is in putting shackles on humanity. That the issue is not the issue. The issue is the pretext. So, to conclude, okay, the fundamental issue is this, is what is the nature of man? Ideas have consequences. If you embrace the idea that humans are consumers, they are destroyers of resources, then every new person born in the world is a threat to everyone else. Every nation is the enemy of every other nation, every race the enemy of every other race, and human liberty is something that must absolutely be suppressed. On the other hand, if you adopt the idea that humans are fundamentally creators, that the net human being on average is an addition to the well-being of all others, then every new person born into the world is a gift. Every nation is fundamentally the friend of every other nation, every race of every race. And the goal and the fundamental purpose of government, rather than being to suppress liberty, to keep humanity within bounds, must be to protect liberty so as to allow us to exercise our true creative potential. Thank you.
All right, so before we go to questions, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask two questions. The first being, I guess, a variant of, let's talk about Godwin's law for a bit, which is the rule that you're not supposed to invoke the Holocaust in modern debate. Aren't we sort of looking at these people's motivations in a way that is not historically contextual? That is, they grew up in a society that held these views, they adopted these views, the views sort of evolved organically. Doesn't sort of ascribing these motivations to them, Nazi-like motivations to them, sort of legitimate the other side's efforts to do that to us, where they say we're climate deniers, invoking Holocaust denial? Is it really fair to be taking their views in this kind of historical perspective?
Yeah, it is. Because these ideas were not universally held. They were widely opposed as being, among other things, unchristian. You know, Malthus is satirized by Dickens in the Christian Carol. He's Scrooge, saying, get rid of the surplus population. I've already mentioned Florence Nightingale and others. Anti-immigration was never an accepted idea among educated people in the United States until these so-called scientific racists came along and said, science proves that we must get rid of these people. Previously, the policy here among educated people had always been to welcome immigrants. These were not universally held ideas. The British community in India vehemently opposed the horrific policies adopted by the governor, by Bulwer-Lytton and later Baden-Powell during these famines, which was to let these people die. They attempted to raise money for charity to save the lives of Indians that were starving. They were stopped. Okay, so these ideas were outrageous, you know, and considered to be so. And German behavior in World War I shocked the world, and German behavior in World War II shocked the world even more. And so these things cannot be excused as, well, this is just what everybody was thinking. These were new ideas which ran counter to accepted morality.
All right.
And 1966, Johnson administration denies famine aid to India unless they have population control. Is that in accord with accepted American morality? I don't think so.
Okay, next question. I grew up in San Fernando Valley in California, where the air pollution levels in the 1970s when I was growing up were stunningly bad. Bad enough that I had asthma as a kid. I collapsed when running laps and found that out the hard way. You would step outdoors, your eyes would immediately burst into tears. Your vision was too blurry to read street signs. If the air itself wasn't too hazy for you to see the street signs. Rivers were badly polluted. We were clear-cutting vast swaths of the country and endangering and or exterminating, driving some species toward extinction. Aren't you sort of denying the environmental movement the credit it's due for having woken the country up in the 1970s to the fact that we had despoiled our environment to an untenable point that many people were being adversely affected, that were being harmed, that we were in fact in danger of destabilizing entire ecosystems through our resource harvesting? You know, isn't it unfair to basically say, you know, you're all a bunch of Nazis and not recognize that, no, there were real problems, there are still real problems in much of the world, and the environmental movement, at least part of their motivation is a genuine desire to repair the environment for the betterment of not only the environment, but also of humanity?
Well, you have to draw a distinction between practical environmentalism, which seeks to make the world a better place for human beings to live in, and ideological environmentalism, which seeks to use the pretext of human damage to the environment, whether real or imagined, as a pretext to implement constraints on humanity. So, yes, certainly we should have reasonable legislation to stop people from dumping toxic waste into the reservoir or sending unlimited amounts of smoke up industrial stacks. Okay, that's a reasonable thing. But when you use that then to make a case that humanity is a criminal species, that its activities must be limited, whether they are good or bad, because look, as I mentioned, take the global warming thing. In the 1970s, we had global cooling going on, and the anti-humanists said, look, there's global cooling, it's being driven by industry, which is being driven by out-of-control economic growth and population growth. They got to be put under control, put us in control. Then in the 80s, the climate trend turned around, and we started to have warming. So look, this global warming is being driven by industry, which is being driven by out-of-control economic growth and population growth. They're out of control, they got to be put under control, put us in control. The problem's completely different, the solution's always the same. And so you take the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a horror story, which has used the pretext of some of these things that need to be regulated to implement expansive powers affecting all kinds of things in society, including implementing dictates that damage the environment. For instance, making it very difficult to establish nuclear power plants to start with. Some people here may know that I did last year a very publicized demonstration showing how easy it would be to run methanol in American cars today And methanol is a fuel that can be made from natural gas or coal. Its current spot price without any subsidy at all is $1.20 a gallon. I took a Chevy Cobalt 2007, we got 24 miles to the gallon on methanol with it, which is equivalent in economy to 60 miles to the gallon on gasoline. We took it in for emissions testing. It had much lower emissions than it did on gasoline, which is not a surprise because, in fact, the first demonstrations of methanol in Motor Vehicle Bureau, was done by the California air quality people down in the 1980s, who were very supportive of methanol at that time as a way to reduce smog. Well, guess what? Environmental Protection Agency bans the sale of methanol fuel for automobiles. Okay, people have asked me, well, gee, if you could do that, why don't you start bottoms up a thing where you convert cars to run on methanol and sell methanol? And I actually found financial backers who would be interested in doing that. But you can't do it. It's against the law. The EPA won't let you. So they're blocking nuclear power. They're blocking methanol, which hurts our environment and our national security and economy. Okay, but they've used the pretext of their mandate to protect the environment to issue vast controls on society.